The Baron wanted no wife, until the widow he hired to feed his girl said, "I pray for her like my own." The plains were hushed beneath a pale sky, the kind of silence that carried weight, as though the earth itself had stopped to listen. Dust curled through broken fence posts, drifting like ghosts across the barren pasture. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sliding over parched grass and jagged stones, a lone sentinel to grief. At the edge of the ranch, beneath a cedar bent crooked by years of wind, the Baron lowered his wife into the ground. The shovel scraped, the soil falling heavy as thunder in his ears. Each clump struck the pine box with the sound of finality, muffled and merciless. Sweat streaked down his face, though the morning air was cool, the kind that bit at the lungs. His scarred hands gripped the shovel until his knuckles whitened, but his eyes, those weary, storm-dark eyes, never left the cross of raw wood he had carved the night before. Beside him, a girl of 6 stood clutching a cloth doll, its stitched smile mocking the hollowness in her own. The child's hair whipped across her face as the prairie wind picked up, rattling the dry weeds, moaning like some lost soul wandering the plains. She did not cry. Her small body trembled, but her eyes were hollow pools, reflecting the cedar, cross, and the man who refused to bend. The Baron's voice was a rasp of gravel, barely more than breath. No more love. No more weakness. The vow hung in the air, as sharp as a blade unsheathed. He pressed the handle of the shovel into the ground, leaned against it, and stared into the horizon, where the sun bled through streaks of cloud like a wound refusing to close. His chest tightened, but he swallowed it down with the same bitter resolve that had kept him alive through years of dust and gunfire. The land, the cattle, the hard whiskey, that would be his salvation, nothing else. But salvation had no warmth for a child. Days passed in a rhythm of silence and chores. The ranch, once alive with laughter and the scent of bread baking, now reeked only of sweat, leather, and smoke from the evening fire. The Baron's hands could mend fences, brand cattle, and break wild horses, but they could not coax food from a pan. Burnt beans, scorched biscuits, and empty plates left the little girl wan, her cheeks hollowing, her steps slowing. Hunger gnawed at her like a wolf in the dark. The nights were worse. The prairie wind howled against the shutters, clawing at the house, carrying with it the cries of coyotes and the echo of a woman's voice he could no longer hear. The girl often woke in the blackness, clutching her doll, her small stomach groaning. He sat by the hearth, staring at the fire's embers, his hands twitching for a bottle, his soul hollowed by helplessness he refused to admit. It was on such a night that the wind brought more than dust. In town, the next day, the Baron's boots struck the boards of the saloon porch, though he did not go inside. Instead, his eyes followed a woman moving quietly down the street, her figure plain against the bustle of wagons and riders. She wore a dark dress faded by years, her bonnet shading a face lined with sorrow yet touched with a quiet strength. Lydia. That was the name whispered by merchants and mothers, widowed, passing through with no kin to claim her. Her hands were steady as she carried a basket of bread to the church steps, her gaze lowered but unbroken. The Baron watched, something tightening in his chest, though he quickly smothered it beneath his vow. He approached her not with softness, but with the same iron edge he gave the world. "You cook?" His voice was rough stone. She looked up, and her eyes were not meek but rivers that refused to dry, clear and steady despite the grief that lived within them. She nodded once. He jerked his head toward the edge of town. "You feed the girl, that's all." It was not an invitation, not even an offer, merely a command forged from desperation. But Lydia did not shrink from it. Her silence spoke louder than any plea, and she followed. That evening, as the prairie turned gold and the shadows stretched long across the land, the ranch smelled for the first time in months of real food. Bread, warm from the hearth, stew thick and rich, the kind that filled not only the stomach but the silence. The girl ate, her small hands trembling around the spoon, eyes wide with disbelief. The Baron stood apart, leaning against the doorframe, the firelight flickering across the scar on his cheek. He did not eat. He only watched. Later, when the girl slept with her doll pressed to her chest, Lydia tucked the blanket higher and lingered by her side. Her lips moved in words soft as the rustle of prairie grass. I pray for her like my own. The Baron heard it from the doorway, the words searing through the armor he had forged around himself. They landed in his chest like a burning brand, branding deeper than grief, deeper than whiskey. His jaw clenched, his hands tightened into fists, yet he did not move. Outside, the wind carried ash and dust across the plains, whispering of things buried yet not forgotten, and inside, a vow began to tremble. The cabin no longer echoed with the hollowness of grief alone. It was still a place of shadows, where silence clung to corners like cobwebs. But now the silence was stitched with softer sounds, the scrape of bread being kneaded on a wooden board, the low hum of a lullaby, cracked at the edges by sorrow yet somehow sweet, the rustle of a blanket being pulled over small shoulders. Lydia's presence moved through the house like a river finding its way across dry land. She did not fill the space with chatter, only with the quiet rhythm of care. The child followed her with wide eyes, clutching her doll as if afraid that, like all things, this comfort too might vanish in the wind. From the shadows, the Baron watched. He lingered by doorframes by the hearth behind the barn slats. He watched her hands break bread. Her voice soothed the girl, her patience never snapping. Each act stirred something deep within him, something he had buried beside a cedar cross. But the chains of his vow held fast. His wife's face still haunted. The lantern light, flickering in corners, a ghost etched in fire and ash. Love, he reminded himself, was only another word for loss. At night, when the fire dimmed and the girl slept with her doll pressed tight, Lydia would kneel by the bedside. Her lips moved in whispers, words barely louder than the creak of wood in the walls. I pray for her like my own. She said it again and again, as though repetition could forge it into scripture. And the Baron, though he turned away, heard every syllable like a brand pressed against scarred flesh. But Lydia's strength was not born from ease. In the quiet hours, when the wind rattled the shutters, her mind slipped back to a different fire, a home lit by flames not of hearth but of ruin. Bandits had come on horses, their guns barking, their laughter cruel. Her husband's body had dropped in the dust, the color leaving his face as fast as the blood. She had screamed until her voice was ash, clawed at the dirt until her nails broke, and when dawn came, nothing remained but smoke and charred beams. Her womb had never quickened with life, and now her arms had been left empty too. Yet she had survived. That survival clung to her like armor, unseen but unyielding. She carried her grief not as a wound, but as a weapon, sharp enough to cut despair from her path. The Baron did not know all of it, not yet. But he saw enough in the way she closed her eyes when the child laughed, the way her hands trembled for a heartbeat before steadying on a spoon or a hymn. Still, the land was not a place for peace. By the time the leaves browned and the mornings came cold, rumors rode the wind. In town, the talk turned sharper, whispered in doorways and over whiskey glasses. Soldiers were combing the plains, hunting deserters who had fled their ranks. Bounty hunters drifted like vultures, chasing debts owed and blood spilled. And from the far ridges, whispers of Apache raiding parties carried on the smoke of campfires. The prairie did not forgive weakness, and women with children were easy prey. One afternoon, the Baron rode back from town with his jaw set tight. His boots hit the dirt heavy, his eyes shadowed. He said nothing of the words he had heard, but his hand lingered near the rifle on the wall, and his gaze swept the horizon more often. That evening, Lydia caught the unease. She found him by the porch, staring at the plains where dusk bled into violet. His shoulders were broad, unbroken, yet there was a stillness in him that carried weight. "The land's restless," she said softly, not looking at him but at the same horizon. He did not answer at first, only the sound of the wind moving across the grass. Finally, he muttered low and gravel deep, "Trouble's coming." Her hands tightened on the shawl around her shoulders, but she nodded. There was no panic in her, only acknowledgement, as though trouble was a guest she had met before. Inside, the child slept, unaware of the shadows gathering beyond her dreams. Lydia returned to the bedside, knelt once more, and whispered the words she had made her vow. I pray for her like my own. The Baron lingered by the doorway again, the weight of the world pressing against his vow. Outside, the coyotes cried, and far off, a hawk circled the fading light. The fragile piece of the cabin trembled like glass on the edge of breaking. The town had always smelled of dust and whiskey, but that morning it smelled of iron too. Soldiers rode in, their uniforms faded, their boots clanging on the boards like iron promises. Faces leathered by sun, rifles slung low, spurs biting the wood with every step. They carried war in their silence. The saloon doors creaked under the weight of their entry, and the chatter in town withered like grass beneath drought. The Baron stood by the blacksmith's forge, hat brim pulled low. He felt their presence before he saw them, the air heavy with the taste of old battles. He turned his face, but it was too late. One soldier stopped mid-stride, eyes narrowing. Recognition flickered, cold, sharp, like a knife remembered. Old blood ran between them. Whispers spread quick through the street, carried on the boots of those who slipped away. Words like betrayal, desertion, debts unpaid. The Baron's jaw tightened. He did not lift his gaze, but he felt eyes on him, prying, weighing. He stepped to his horse and mounted without a word. The leather creaked, the bit clinked, and with a hard tug on the reins, he vanished down the road, the weight of shadows following. At the ranch, the air was different, quieter, but tense, like the stillness before lightning splits the sky. Lydia sensed it before he spoke a word. She saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the edge that carved his silence sharper than usual. You can't fence out everything, she said softly that night, her hands smoothing the girl's hair as the child drifted in sleep. Your girl needs more than fences and guns. Her voice was gentle but urgent, like a prayer spoken with trembling faith. The Baron's eyes were on the fire, its flames reflecting the scars across his cheek. He said nothing, only poured whiskey into his glass, the silence louder than any reply, but resistance cracked in smaller ways. The next day, as riders thundered past on the road, the little girl startled, clutching Lydia's skirts, hiding in the folds of her dress. The Baron stepped out from the barn, froze at the sight, the child's small hands knotted in fear around Lydia's dress, her eyes searching the widow for protection. Not him. Something in him shifted. Anger at first, bitter as gall. Then awe, unspoken, unwanted. He turned away before it could settle too deep. The storm broke not with thunder, but with fire. It came at dusk. The cattle lowed in panic, hooves drumming the earth like war drums. Then the smell hit, smoke, thick and acrid. The barn was ablaze, flames clawing skyward, sparks devouring the dry grass. The roar of fire drowned the cries of beasts scattering. Into the night, the girl's scream tore the air. Lydia ran without hesitation, skirts gathered, hair flying. The fire threw shadows across her face, heat searing her skin, but she pressed on. Inside, the child huddled, choking on smoke, eyes wide with terror. Lydia wrapped her arms around her, pulling her into her chest. Sparks bit into her hands. Fire licked at her sleeves, yet her resolve never faltered. The Baron charged through the smoke, coughing, eyes burning. He caught them in the doorway, one arm dragging Lydia, the other scooping his daughter. Flames snapped behind them as they stumbled into the night air. He shoved Lydia clear of falling beams, his grip bruising, his breath ragged. When at last the fire roared behind them, consuming the barn to its bones, he looked at her scorched hands clutching the girl, at her face streaked with ash. Unbroken. For a heartbeat, his anger fractured, giving way to something raw, something close to awe. She had done what he could not. Walked into fire for his blood. The night pressed close, heavy with smoke and the stench of loss. The cattle were gone, the barn reduced to embers, the sky painted red as if the land itself bled. The girl whimpered against Lydia's chest, and Lydia held her tighter, whispering prayers into her hair. The Baron stared out at the horizon, where fire glow bled into black sky. His ears caught it then. Distant drums, faint but steady, carried. On the wind. War or raid. He could not tell. But the sound was enough. The past was no longer behind him. It rode on the horizon, red as the fire that had just taken his barn. The fire left behind silence. Not the soft kind that brings peace, but a silence heavy as stone, pressing into the cabin's walls, sinking into its floorboards. Smoke still lingered in the air, faint and bitter, the ghost of what had burned. Outside, the barn lay in ruins, black ribs of timber jutting from ash like the bones of some fallen beast. Inside, Lydia sat by the table, her hands swathed in cloth strips. The skin beneath was raw, blistered, yet she bore it with quiet dignity, her face calm, her lips set. The girl leaned against her, clinging as if the widow's presence alone could keep the world from breaking. The Baron stood in the doorway, shadow thick around him. Gratitude and guilt warred in his chest, but words were stones he could not lift. At last, he forced them out, rough and uneven. Why risk your life for what ain't yours? Lydia's gaze lifted, steady and unflinching. Her voice was low, but sharp as steel drawn from a sheath. She is mine, in prayer, in heart, if not in blood. The words struck him harder than the fire ever could. He turned his head, jaw tight, but the echo of them clung to his ribs, rattling through him like chains shaken loose. Night fell. The prairie wind sighed through the cracks, carrying ash and coyote song. The child slept sound, nestled with her, doll and Lydia's shawl wrapped close. But between the two adults, the air thickened with something unspoken, dangerous as kindling too near a flame. Glances lingered too long. His eyes caught the curve of her hands as she bound her burns, the shadow of her face in lantern light. Hers lingered on the weight of his shoulders, the scar carved across his cheek. Once, in the kitchen, their hands brushed when she passed him. A plate. And yet, like animals burned once too often, they retreated quick. Lydia turned her back, her chest tightening with guilt. To let her heart stir felt like betrayal, like turning from the husband buried in her memory. The Baron, pacing by the window, clenched his fists. Desire in him felt like sin, a knife in the grave of the woman he had sworn never to forget. Still, the pull grew. It was the child who broke the balance. One morning, as the sun cracked over the horizon, spilling red, light across the charred barn, the little girl tugged at Lydia's skirts. Her voice was soft, half dreaming, yet the words she spoke cut deeper than any blade. Ma. The silence that followed was sharper than gunfire. Lydia froze, her burned hands trembling around the cloth she held. Her eyes shone with sudden tears. She dared not let fall. The Baron, hearing it from the porch, went rigid. His chest burned, his vow screaming against the sound of that word. Without a word, he stormed out, boots striking hard against the dirt. The night swallowed him, stars glittering cold above. He walked until the cabin's lantern light was a dim flicker, until the prairie wind was the only companion. His hat brim shadowed his face, but nothing could shadow the weight in his eyes. He stared at the heavens, wide and endless, the same stars that had watched over him when his wife was alive, when her laughter still warmed the air. His throat tightened as he whispered into the dark, the words pulled from a place deeper than pride. I never asked for this. The confession drifted upward, thin as smoke, swallowed by the night sky. His heart ached with a sorrow that refused. To die, with a desire he could not claim, with a bond he could no longer deny was forming around him. Fate was weaving threads tighter than his vow, threads he could not cut no matter how sharp the blade. Behind him, in the cabin, Lydia lay awake. Her eyes opened to the dark. Her hands ached, her heart warred with memory, but the sound of that single word, Ma, echoed within her like a church bell struck at midnight. And the silence between them, heavy as ever, now glowed faint with the first spark of a forbidden flame. The morning came restless. The sky was pale, clouds bruised with storm, the air thick with the scent of something near breaking. The ranch stood scarred, barn burned, fences split, but still clung stubborn to the land. The Baron saddled his horse in silence, his scarred hands steady, though his chest carried the weight of sleepless nights. Then the sound came. Boots, hooves, the grind of iron against dust. Soldiers. They rode into the yard with the swagger of men who had nothing left to lose. Their uniforms were ragged, colors dulled by sweat and dirt, rifles glinting in the weak sun. The one who had recognized the Baron in town dismounted first. His eyes were cold, lips curled in a grin that was all blade. "You know what you owe," he said. "Allegiance or blood?" The Baron's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, hat low, voice gravel thick. "I owe nothing." Silence stretched, then broke in thunder. Gunfire split the air, sharp as lightning striking bone. The girl screamed from inside the cabin. Horses reared, dust rose, bullets tore through wood and earth. The ranch became a battlefield. The Baron fought with raw fury, his rifle barking, his body moving with the muscle memory of wars past. Each shot rang like a vow, each strike against the tide of men who came hungry for his ruin. But numbers swallowed him. For every man he felled, two more pressed forward. Splinters bit his skin, bullets scorched his hat brim. Inside, Lydia pulled the child into the root cellar, the trapdoor closing above them. The girl shook, sobbing into her skirts, while Lydia pressed the child to her chest, whispering prayers through tears she could not stop. "Hush, little one. The Lord keeps us." Her voice trembled, cracked, yet it wrapped the child like armor against the storm of violence raging overhead. Outside, the Baron's strength faltered. Sweat and blood blurred his sight. A bullet grazed, his shoulder spinning him, driving him to his knees in the dirt. His breath came ragged, his hands slick on the rifle. Around him, soldiers advanced, boots thudding, rifles raised for the final blow. And then, Lydia. She emerged from the cabin, the old shotgun clutched tight, her burned hands trembling yet unbroken. Smoke and dust swirled around her, firelight, flickering from shattered timbers. Her eyes blazed, fierce with something stronger than fear. She raised the weapon, steady now, and fired. The shot thundered. One soldier fell, then another as she cocked and fired again. The kick bruised her. Smoke burned her lungs, but she did not falter. She became the image of defiance itself. Widow, servant, savior, her dress streaked with blood not her own, her resolve cutting sharper than steel. The Baron, half blinded with sweat, saw her through the haze, saw her standing in firelight and Smoke, his daughter's guardian, his own salvation. Rage surged back into him, and with it, the will to rise. Together they drove the soldiers back, bodies dropping into the dirt, until the gunfire thinned, then stopped. Silence fell, ragged and heavy, broken only by the groan of wind through shattered beams. Bodies lay still across the yard, rifles abandoned, blood soaking into the dust. The ranch was scorched again, marked by violence deeper than flame. The child sobbed from the cellar, then burst into the open, running straight into Lydia's arms. Lydia dropped the shotgun and caught her, holding her tight, tears streaking her ash-stained face. The Baron stumbled, his knees buckling, blood running warm from the wound at his shoulder. He fell against the porch post, his breath harsh, eyes locked on Lydia, not as widow, not as servant, not even as stranger, but as salvation. "You're the strongest thing I ever knew," he rasped, words torn from a place he had buried long ago. Lydia turned to him, the girl pressed between them, tears falling freely now. They dropped onto his cheek, mingling with his blood, warm against the cold night that closed in around them. In that broken, smoke-choked silence, forbidden love breathed at last into the open, fragile, trembling, yet alive. Dawn rose slow and mournful over the plains, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold. Smoke still lingered on the wind, the scent of char and gunpowder woven into the morning air. The fields lay ruined, fences broken, earth scorched, the barn nothing more than blackened ribs clawing against the sky. Yet within the wreckage, something Unbroken stirred, fragile but unyielding. The Baron sat on the porch, his body a map of wounds, his face etched with weariness deeper than years. The silence was not empty this time. It carried the soft breath of the child asleep in Lydia's arms. Her small chest rose and fell steady. Her fingers curled tight into the widow's dress, as if claiming her by instinct alone. The sight twisted him, cracked him. He had fought wars, buried friends, buried love itself beneath a cedar cross. And still, this moment brought him to his knees. Slowly, he rose from the step and crossed the floorboards, his boots whispering against the wood. He knelt before them, his scarred hands trembling as he laid them against his thighs. His voice came rough, but it carried the weight of a vow breaking. "You prayed for her like your own." His eyes flicked from the child to Lydia, unsteady, raw. "Pray for me too." The words shook, the strength in him faltering, leaving behind only a man stripped of his armor. His vow against love, forged in grief and fire, crumbled to dust with the dawn. Lydia's eyes lifted to his. They were rimmed with sorrow, yet within them glowed something gentler, something that had endured every flame and storm. Slowly, she nodded. Hope glimmered there, fragile as morning light, yet real enough to burn away the night. They set to rebuilding not with haste, but with stubborn resolve. Boards hammered where fire had eaten, fences mended where hoof and bullet had torn them down. Smoke rose again, this time from fresh bread, not ruin. The girl's laughter, rare, hesitant at first, began to weave itself through the air like music long forgotten. But the land, ever cruel, carried whispers just as steady as the wind. Neighbors passed along their judgments like coins at market. The Baron